The child was sitting on a flat stone at the river's edge, very still, the way small animals go still when they know they are alone in the world and have not yet decided whether to be afraid of it. I almost rode past her. My outriders were ahead, scouting the ford before we crossed into the valley below Thornfen. The afternoon light on the ashwater was low and sharp, turning the river to hammered copper, and I had my head bent over the supply manifest Councillor Drevitt had pressed into my hands at dawn. There were 17 signatories missing on the salt trade accord. There was a border grievance in the east that had been festering since midwinter. I was a king, and a king is never truly on a river crossing. He is always somewhere else, thinking about something that needs his name or his judgment or his blood. Then the little figure on the stone shifted, and I looked up. She was perhaps 4 years old, perhaps a little younger. Her dress was gray-green wool, a child's practical thing, damp at the hem where the water had reached her. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She had a river pebble in each hand, turning them over and over, the way children do when they are working something out. And she was not crying, which was the first thing that struck me as strange. A child alone on a river stone, miles from the nearest village, and she was not crying. My horse stopped on its own. I have no other explanation. One moment we were moving, and the next Carvel had simply halted and lowered his head, as if he too had noticed something that required stillness. "Hold," I said to the 2 guardsmen nearest me, not loudly, not wanting to startle her. I dismounted and walked to the bank. She heard my boots on the gravel and looked up. And the world did something I cannot properly describe, even now. It shifted, the way the river itself shifts when you throw a stone into a still reach, the surface suddenly telling you there is more depth below than you had imagined. A ripple went through everything. The child had silver-gray eyes. My eyes are silver-gray. My father's eyes were silver-gray. In the Kelvorn line it is a thing spoken of in the old songs, the Ashwater eyes. The chroniclers call them, because the river has that same color at dusk. They are uncommon. I have not, in 32 years of life, looked at a stranger and seen them looking back. She looked at me with perfect composure and said, "I am waiting." I crouched down on the bank so I was at her level. "Who are you waiting for?" "My mama." She said it simply, without distress, as if waiting for her mother on a flat stone in the middle of a river crossing was the most reasonable thing in the world, and she had every confidence the arrangement would come good. She told me to stay here and not move, and I have not moved. Where did she go? The child considered. Back to the road. She held up one of the pebbles, a white one smooth as a knuckle. "I found this. It is a good one." "It is," I agreed. I looked at the pebble, and I looked at her eyes, and something behind my ribs was doing something that had no name and no precedent in any history of my house. "I am Kale," I said, giving her my given name and not my title. "I am Wren," she said. My chief guardsman Aldrich was at my shoulder then, low-voiced. "My lord, there is a woman running from the road." I stood. A woman was coming through the sedge grass along the river path, running, her boots catching in the grass, her breath coming hard. She wore a plain brown traveling cloak, pack straps over her shoulders, a healer's satchel at her hip. Her dark hair was braided back, but pieces had come loose in the running. She hadn't yet seen me. She had eyes only for the stone and the small figure sitting on it. "Wren." The relief in her voice was so acute it was almost painful to hear. "Wren, I told you to stay at the marker stone, not—" And then she saw me and she stopped. 5 paces away, the breath going out of her, the color leaving her face. I knew her. That was the second thing my body did before my mind caught up. I knew her the way you know a piece of music you haven't heard in years, the recognition arriving whole, in a single breath, before you can explain it. Her name was Sable. She had been a river healer in the settlement of Fenwick, the eastern edge of Kelvorn territory, 5 years ago. She had come to the hold that winter to treat an outbreak of river fever among the outer pack wolves, 6 of them badly ill, 2 not expected to live. She had stayed 2 months. She had saved both wolves that the pack physician had given up on, and 4 others besides. She had sat in the infirmary by lamplight, and she had made remedies from things she grew or gathered herself, and she had been so quiet about it all, not meek, not shrinking, but genuinely unbothered by notice, that I had found myself going to the infirmary in the evenings more often than I had any professional reason to. The river healer from Fenwick who talked to the sick wolves the way some people talk to old friends, as though illness were simply a difficult visitor who would leave when it was ready. I had thought about her after she left, more than I had any orderly reason to. 5 years. She was here. She was thinner in the face than I remembered, and there were shadows under her eyes, and she was looking at me with the expression of someone who has just stepped into a room they were not prepared to enter. "My lord," she said, not smoothly, not with the ease of a woman who had rehearsed this. She said it the way a person says something they have been dreading. "Sable," my voice was steadier than I expected, "your daughter found a good river stone." Wren held it up for her mother's confirmation. "It is very smooth, Mama." Sable did not look at the stone. She was looking at me with gray-green eyes. Her own were gray-green, a shade different from mine and from Wren's, more like moss than like water, and the calculation running behind them was visible. Not deception, I would realize later. She was not a woman built for deception. What I was seeing was someone working out the true shape of a moment, the way a healer looks at a wound and assesses it clearly before speaking. "Come away from the stone, Wren," she said quietly. Wren came, tucking both pebbles into her pocket with great care. She slipped her hand into her mother's without being asked, the way children do when they sense that the adults near them need anchoring. I looked at Wren's hand in Sable's. I looked at the silver-gray eyes. I was a king, and I had been trained from boyhood to read a room, to see what people were not saying as clearly as what they were. I was looking at what was not being said with perfect clarity, and yet I found myself needing to say it plainly, if only to have something solid to stand on. "How old is she?" I asked. Sable was quiet for a moment, not long, barely 3 heartbeats, but I counted them. "She will be 4 in the month of Ashfall," she said. Ashfall, 4 months from now. The month of Ashfall, 4 years ahead from the winter Sable had spent at the hold. I looked at Wren. Wren looked back at me with the patient silver-gray regard of someone who had not yet learned that some conversations were not for her to be present at. "Wren," I said, "my horse is named Carvel. He is very large and he eats apples. Would you like to see him?" "Yes," she said immediately, with the complete certainty of a person who has never had to negotiate for the things she wanted. I gestured to Aldrich. He came without a word and led Wren by the hand toward where Carvel stood, producing a folded cloth from his coat that turned out to contain half an apple, which he offered to the horse with the practiced ease of a man who has served a king long enough to know that witnesses are sometimes best occupied at a distance. Sable watched her daughter go with the apple and the horse, and the look on her face in that unguarded moment was everything, pride and exhaustion, and something that might have been grief, except that grief has no direction, and what she was feeling was pointed straight at the small figure reaching up to feed a quarter apple to a very patient gray stallion. Then she looked at me, and I saw her decide to be honest. "I did not hide her from you to injure you," she said. "I need you to believe that first before anything else. Tell me the rest." She shifted the healer's satchel on her hip. Something about the gesture, the unconscious practicality of it, steadied me. This was a woman who moved through difficult things the way water moves through stone channels, without drama, without waste. "When I left the hold that spring," she said, "I did not know. I found out 2 months later in Fenwick. I had a practice there. I had a home. Wren was born there in the house where I grew up." She said all of this to the middle distance, not to me. I told myself I would write to the hold when she was old enough, when I had worked out what to say, when there was some shape to it that would make sense. A pause. 4 years is a long time to find the right shape for a thing. You were traveling when we found her today. West to my sister's settlement at Caldvain. She looked at me now. I was not running. I was not hiding any further. Wren knows she has a father. She knows he is a king. I told her last month a child should know that much. I had not yet decided how to reach you. And yet the river decided first. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. Yes, the river apparently had its own schedule. I stood on the bank of the Ashwater in the late copper light and tried to think like a king, which is to say I tried to think about consequences and provisions and what must be formally arranged. A heir. A Kelvorn heir. The line required. The council would need to be convened, the pack notified, the blood rights formally established. All of it ran through my mind in the orderly way that duty runs through a mind built for it. None of it was what I was actually thinking about. What I was thinking about was a child feeding apples to a horse with complete confidence that the horse would be reasonable about it. What I was thinking about was 4 years of evenings that had been empty without my understanding quite why. What I was thinking about was a woman in a brown traveling cloak who had just told me she had not been hiding. She had been trying to find the right shape for the truth. And the truth of that was, I could not quarrel with it, because I had been failing to find the right shape for certain things myself for 5 years and longer. Sable. She met my eyes. Will you ride with us to Thornfen? Not as a commanded thing, you will always have the choice in this, that I promise you. But there are things to be arranged, and I would rather arrange them with you present than with you absent. And Wren. Wren comes where you come, that is not a question. She was quiet for a moment, not wavering, simply making sure, in the way she did everything, that the assessment was accurate before she committed to it. Yes, she said, we will ride with you to Thornfen. Wren, when Aldrich brought her back from Carvel, was delighted to learn she would be riding in the saddle. She had never been on a horse. This seemed to her not a misfortune but a situation that was simply awaiting its correction, and she received it with the same composed confidence with which she received everything. I lifted her up in front of me on Carvel, who accepted this addition without complaint, being a horse of excellent character. We rode south along the Ashwater toward the ford. Wren held the pommel with both hands, not gripping, just resting, already learning the rhythm of the horse's movement without being told. She held her 2 pebbles in her left fist against the pommel. After a little while, she looked up at me over her shoulder with the silver-gray eyes that were mine and not mine, and said, "Carvel is a good horse." "He is the best horse I have ever had," I said. "I think so too," she agreed, with all the authority of someone who had now met exactly one horse and found the sample satisfactory. We came to the ford. The water was shallow and clear, the riverbed pale stones below, and Wren leaned forward to watch the water part around Carvel's hooves with an expression of absolute wonder, not afraid of the moving water, not startled, simply absorbing it. I held her steady with one arm across her middle, the most natural thing, as if I had been doing it always. Sable rode beside us on a quiet brown mare Aldrich had procured from somewhere with characteristic efficiency. She was watching me with the expression of someone assembling a careful judgment. I let her look. She was a healer. Looking was how she understood things. "What do you remember of me?" I asked her, when the ford was behind us and the road opened into the valley. "You came to the infirmary every evening," she said. "You said you were checking on the sick wolves." "I was. The wolves were very well after the first week. You kept coming anyway. The second week was extremely thorough follow-up care." She looked at me steadily. "You always brought something, firewood, a lamp oil refill. Once you brought a book because you said the third wolf on the left looked bored." He did, his ears were flat. Boredom makes the ears go flat. He couldn't read. I read it to him. He seemed to appreciate the company. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one, and the beginning of it was enough to undo me far more thoroughly than a full smile would have. I had spent 5 years forgetting it approximately once a week, and seeing it now, I understood the failure of the project completely. "You were not what I expected a king to be," she said. "That was the difficulty in the end. You were easier to think about than I wanted you to be." "I thought about you," I said, "after you left, more than I had orderly reason to." "And yet you did not send word." "No," I admitted. "I told myself I would when there was a good reason to summon a healer back from her own practice, when there was something that needed her. I was a king, and I thought in terms of need and function. I did not yet know how to think in terms of simply wanting someone to be in the same room with me because the room was better for it." She considered this. 4 years is a long time for both of us to have been working on the same problem from different directions. "It is." Ren from the saddle in front of me said, "Are you my papa?" The road went quiet. The outriders ahead seemed to find something urgently interesting about the horizon. Aldrich, to my right, studied his gauntlet. I looked down at the small face that was looking up at me with the expression that was becoming familiar to me. The patient, unfrightened, ready for whatever comes expression of a child who has been raised by a woman who does not frighten easily. "Yes," I said, "I am." "I thought so," she said. "We have the same eyes." She turned back to watch the road ahead, apparently satisfied that this had been established and we could all proceed on that basis. I heard Sable exhale, not with relief, or not only with relief. It was a longer breath than that, a breath at the end of something that had been held for a very long time. We reached Thornfinn by late afternoon. It was a river hold, not one of the great fortress kingdoms, a stone-walled settlement built over the Ashwater's southern bend, known for the bridge market and the silver workings in the cliffs above. The pack there numbered several hundred, with a market square and a great meeting hall of pale river stone, the Kelvorn banner, a silver wave on dark water flying above the gates. The gate watch saw us coming and stood aside, and then saw the king dismounting in the courtyard with a small child on his arm and a woman in a traveling cloak beside him. And there was a very distinctive quality to the stillness that a gatehouse develops when it is doing its best to observe without appearing to observe. I carried Ren into the hold. She had not asked to be carried, but when I set her down, the courtyard stones were cold and she had no proper boots, only soft indoor shoes, damp from the river. And I had simply picked her up and she had gone with it, both pebbles still in her fist. "This is a big house," Ren said, looking around at the river stone walls, the iron lanterns, the pack wolves in the yard who had gone very still and were staring at us. "It is," I said. "It belongs to the Ashwater pack. We are guests here tonight." "Are those wolves?" 3 of the pack wolves had detached from the rest and were crossing the courtyard toward us slowly, with the careful deliberateness of animals who are following something they cannot explain. They were Thornfinn greys, large and winter-coated still, their ears up. Sable stepped close, not in front of me, not interposing herself between the wolves and Ren as if I were a threat, but beside me, at my shoulder, the instinct of a woman who had spent years watching over something she loved. The lead wolf stopped in front of me. It looked at Ren. Ren looked back with complete composure and said, "Hello." The wolf lowered its head and set its chin against the stone in front of her feet. Not a trained gesture, not a commanded one. The wolf simply went down. The other 2 followed. I had seen pack wolves do this for their alpha, for the Luna, for a recognized mate. I had not seen it done for a 4-year-old child in soft shoes with 2 river pebbles in her fist. The courtyard was very quiet. Ren looked at the wolves, and then she looked up at me and she said, "Can I pet them?" "Yes," I said, "they would like that very much." She went and crouched in front of the lead wolf with the same certainty with which she did everything, and she put her small hand on the wolf's gray head, and the wolf remained absolutely still for her, which is something pack wolves do not generally do for strangers, or for children they have never met. Sable stood beside me and did not say anything for a moment. "This happened in Fenwick too," she said quietly. "Dogs. The village dogs would find her wherever she was and lie down with her. She never seemed surprised by it." "She is Kelvorn," I said. "My father said the Ashwater pack has always known its own." She looked at me. "Your father did not know her." "No, but he would have. He would have looked at her eyes and known." Sable looked at her daughter with the wolves, and the look on her face was something I will carry for the rest of my life. A mother at the end of 4 years of carrying something alone, watching the thing she had been afraid to hope for happen simply and irrevocably in a river-hold courtyard. The hold master, Rendwick, met us inside and with admirable self-possession made arrangements without requiring explanations. A warm room for Sable and Wren adjoining the guest quarters, a fire laid, food sent up, dry boots found from somewhere for a child who turned out to be the same size as the hold master's own youngest. Wren ate dinner with the efficiency and focus of a child who has been traveling all day. She ate everything on her plate and then reported accurately on each thing she had eaten and whether it had been satisfactory, all of it satisfactory. The bread was the best part. She had never had butter that good before. After dinner she fell asleep almost immediately, curled in the great bed with a Thornfin wolf pup that had materialized from somewhere and apparently intended to stay. Sable sat by the fire with me in the outer room, the door to the sleeping room open a hand width so she could hear. The fire was low and warm. Outside, the ashwater ran over the stones in the dark. "She sleeps like that every night," Sable said. "She was never difficult to settle, from the beginning. She would look at whatever room she was in, decide it was acceptable and close her eyes." "She has the Kelvorn practicality," I said. "My grandfather was the same. Never wasted a moment on worry that could be spent on sleep." Sable smiled at that, a real one this time, unguarded in the firelight. It was better than I remembered, and I had remembered it clearly. "She asked me last month," Sable said, "whether her father was a good man. I told her yes. She asked me how I knew if I had not seen him in a long time. I told her I had watched him spend an entire evening reading to a wolf with flat ears, and that seemed like a reasonable measure of a person." She looked at the fire. "She accepted that." "She accepts things very readily." "She does. She decides quickly what the truth is, and then she is done with the deciding. It is one of her best qualities." She decided very quickly that I was her father. She had already decided before she spoke. She was just confirming it. Sable looked at me now. "She is like you in that way. You decide things behind the eyes, and then you speak what you have already settled. It is a useful habit for a king." "It is a useful habit for anyone." She paused. "What will happen now, formally?" "She is my heir, the only one. That is not a politics question. It is simply the truth, and the blood rights will establish it formally before the Pack Council at Kelvorn when we return. She will come home to Kelvorn. She will be raised there with everything due a Kelvorn heir." I looked at her directly. "What happens to you is a separate question, and it is yours to answer, not mine to decide. I want to be clear about that. You came west because you had family at Caldvain. That journey is still yours to take or not take, as you choose." She was quiet for a moment. "I left the hold 5 years ago," she said carefully, "because I was a river healer from Fenwick with no bond and no standing, and you were a king with a council that had been trying to arrange your mating right for 3 years, and staying would have been a cruelty to myself that I was not willing to perform." She looked at her hands. "I have not regretted the leaving. I regret the 4 years of silence. Those are different things." "They are. Wren should have had her father from the beginning. That is the only thing I would change." She raised her eyes to mine. "Not the leaving, only the 4 years of silence that came after." "I understand." "Do you?" "Yes. You left so as not to be a thing that was kept out of guilt or obligation. That is not something I can argue with. If you had told me at the hold 5 years ago, the answer might have been obligation, and you were too sensible to accept that. She looked at me for a moment with the same steady healer's attention with which she had looked at everything since the riverbank, the look that was reading deeper than the surface. What would the answer be now? She asked. I considered the fire. I considered the question. I was a man who did not speak without having settled the thing first, and I was not going to start now. When you left the hold, I said, I went to the infirmary the next evening from habit and you were not there. The lamp was out. The remedies were cleared from the shelf. And I stood there long enough that Aldrich came to find me, which is something Aldrich only does when I have been gone past a reasonable amount of time. I paused. I have been a king all my life. I know what it is to make decisions about the pack, about the border, about the council's needs and the territory's future. I did not know, until that evening, what it was to stand in an empty room and understand that the thing that had made it worth going to was gone. Sable was still. The answer now, I said, is not obligation. The answer now is that I spent 5 years explaining to myself why I did not send for you, and every explanation was correct, and none of them were the true reason, and the true reason was that I was a king who did not know how to say, I would like you to be here because the place is better when you are in it. Not because of duty, not because of the bond or the heir or any formal arrangement, because you are who you are. I looked at her. That is the answer now. The fire cracked, the river ran. Sable looked at me for a long time with the gray-green eyes that were hers alone. That is a better answer, she said at last. I thought you might find it more persuasive than the alternatives. Another beginning of a smile, the one I had spent 5 years failing to forget. You read to a wolf with flat ears. He was bored. You are not what I expected a king to be, she said again, but differently this time. Not with the note of rueful surprise she had used on the road, with something that was opening carefully, like a hand uncurling from something it has held a very long time. What did you expect? Someone who would not stop in a river crossing for an unknown child on a stone. Someone whose horse would not simply halt of its own accord. Carvel has good instincts. So do you, she said it plainly without embellishment. In the other room, Wren made a small sound in her sleep, a contented sound, the sound of a child dreaming something satisfactory, and the wolf pup shifted to accommodate her. We sat by the fire and we talked as people talk when they are returning to each other after a long absence, not recapping the years in any systematic way, but finding the shape of things. The river healers' practice in Fenwick, the nature and causes of river fever in the eastern settlements, the pack politics of Kelvorn's last 3 winters, the bread-baking competition at Thornfinn Market that Sable had read about once in a dispatch, and laughed at for no reason she could fully explain. Ordinary things. Things that are not ordinarily discussed between a king and a woman in a fire-lit room, and which are, perhaps for that reason, the only things worth discussing. The fire burned low, and I fed it once, and it burned low again. You should sleep, she said, not unkindly. You have a ford to manage in the morning, and a council to face at Kelvorn. The council can wait. The council never actually waits. No, I agreed, but it imagines it can, and that imagination gives me approximately 1 more hour before I am obligated to go and be a king again. I looked at her. I would rather spend that hour here. She did not argue. She settled back in the chair with the easy unself-consciousness of a woman who has decided something and who does not need to announce it or qualify it. The river ran. The fire breathed. In the next room my daughter slept. At Kelvorn 2 weeks later, the blood rites were held. They were not a public ceremony. I had insisted on this, not from any desire for secrecy, but because the pack's formal recognition of a Kelvorn heir is a matter for the pack elders and the alpha bloodline, not for spectacle. Wren stood in the inner hall with the elder Morcath, who was old enough to have known my grandfather, and who looked at the silver-gray eyes for exactly as long as he needed to before he said, without any ceremony at all, "Ashwater eyes. Yes, this is the daughter of Cale Kelvorn." He placed his hand over hers with the gravity of a man performing a rite he has been waiting to perform for 32 years, and the pack seal under the floor of the old hall, the iron plate that the old chronicles say was set there by the first alpha of the line, went warm. Not dramatically, not with any fire or light. Simply warm, the way old iron goes warm when it is near what it was made for. Wren looked at the floor under her feet and said, "It is warmer here." "Yes," Morkath said, "it knows you." She considered this. "That is a good thing to know," she concluded, and she was right. The pack council was less straightforward, which was predictable. There were questions about precedent and protocol, and the appropriate arrangement of a mating rite, and whether the alpha's unmarried status required correction by a formal council-arranged process. And Drevitt in particular had a great deal to say about the succession implications of an heir without a recognized Luna. I let him say it. I have found over the years that Drevitt is better for having said things than for having them stopped mid-saying. He said a number of things. He said that the blood right alone did not constitute full formal recognition without the Luna question resolved, which was technically true and entirely beside the point. He said that the Council's advisory role in mating matters had been established by the Kelvorn Accords of 2 generations past, which was also true and also beside the point. He said that the arrangements required for a recognized heir were distinct from, and did not imply the arrangements required for a recognized Luna, and he looked at me over the edge of this statement with the expression of a man who has been waiting some years to say it, and finds the saying satisfying. I let him finish. Then I said, "Sable of Fenwick came to this hold 5 years ago and saved 6 wolves of the Kelvorn pack when my own pack physician had given up on 2 of them. She has practiced the healing arts in the eastern settlements for the length of our territory's most difficult frontier winter without the pack's protection or resources, because she was raised to be useful, and she did not wait to be asked. She has raised a Kelvorn heir alone for 4 years with such steadiness that the child arrived at my river crossing able to sit on a stone in the middle of nowhere without crying, on the strength of a promise her mother made to her that things would come good. I looked at the council. I do not need a formal arrangement to tell me who belongs at this hold. I have known for 5 years. I was simply the last to say it plainly. Elder Morkath, at the far end of the table, set down his cup and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He had seen the eyes, and he had felt the warmth rise through the floor of the old hall, and a man who has been waiting 32 years for an heir already knows when a matter is settled. Drevitt made 2 or 3 more remarks. I allowed this. Eventually he stopped. The pack wolves of Kelvorn had the matter settled before the council did. They had settled it the evening we returned, when Wren walked into the great yard, and 3 wolves who had been winter-gray and restless for 6 months lay down in the dirt in front of her. The others followed one by one over the next several days, not in any formal way, simply as packs make up their minds. Individually, and then all together, and then it is done. Sable did not come to the council chamber. She was in the infirmary, where she had gone on the first morning at Kelvorn to check on a wolf with a shoulder injury that she had noticed was favoring its left side, and where she had been, in one capacity or another, every day since. She was not performing any claim. She was not positioning herself. She was simply doing the work that was in front of her, in the place where the work needed to be done. On the 3rd day, the pack physician Oren, who had been at Kelvorn for 11 years and who had, 5 years earlier, been one of the physicians who had given up on the 2 sickest fever wolves, came to find me in the map room. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man choosing his words carefully. "The woman from Fenwick," he said at last. "Yes. She has a method for the shoulder tendon that I have not seen before. She draws the inflammation out differently. The wolf is bearing weight on it this morning." He paused. "She showed me. She did not wait to be asked." "She never does." He nodded slowly. "She also has something for the old gray wolf's hip, the one who has been limping since the autumn campaign. I tried 6 things for that hip." He paused again. "She tried one thing. And this morning the gray wolf walked to the water trough on his own for the first time in 3 months." I looked at him. "Is there something you want to say, Oren?" "Only that she is very good," he said, "and that I may have been wrong about the fever wolves, 5 years ago, about the 2 I gave up on." He said it plainly, without elaboration. It is the most generous form of an apology, a statement of fact, offered without qualification. "Yes," I said. "She was right and you were wrong. I think she would tell you the same if you asked her. She would probably also tell you why, which I expect you would find useful." He went back to the infirmary. I heard later that he and Sable talked for 3 hours. This is the thing about her that the council and the formal records will never quite capture. She does not take up space for the sake of taking up space. She takes up exactly the space that is needed and no more, and the space always turns out to be more necessary than you understood while she was filling it. I told her what the council had said. We were sitting on the wall above the ashwater in the early evening light, watching Wren throw pebbles into the river below. She had, by now, added 6 Kelvorn pebbles to her collection, sorted by color and texture in a small box Aldrich had found for her, and which she carried everywhere. She had opinions about each one. "And what did you say?" Sable asked. I said I have known for 5 years. I was simply the last to say it plainly. She was quiet for a moment, watching Wren. "She threw a gray one and a white one in at the same time," Sable said. "She said they were friends and they should go together." "She is 4. She is extremely 4, Sable agreed. Below us, Wren looked up and raised both arms. The way children raise both arms when they want to be picked up or when they simply want the people above them to know that they are there and that everything is satisfactory, and they would like someone to note it. I raised my hand back. She went back to the pebbles. I looked at Sable in the evening light on the ashwater wall, and I thought about a woman who had stood on a river bank and decided to be honest, and a child who had known her own father by his eyes, and a hold that had gone warmer in 1 week than it had in 5 years, in ways that had nothing to do with the season. "You said on the road," I said, "that you had not yet decided how to reach me, that Wren knew she had a father but you had not yet worked out what to say." "Yes." "What were you going to say when you had worked it out?" She turned the question over, the way she turned most things over, thoroughly, without haste. "I was going to say, here is your daughter, and she is extraordinary, and I have done my best by her, and now I would like her to have everything she is owed." She paused. I was going to say it and then step back, and let the arrangements happen around her and go back to Fenwick when it was done. "And now?" She looked at me. "The river moved its schedule," she said. "Yes. And you said things by a fireplace that a king is not generally expected to say. I have been told I am not what people expect." "By whom?" "By a river healer twice." She looked at the water below. The ashwater was copper gold in the evening light as it had been at the ford where we found Wren on her stone. The same river, a different crossing. "I am not going back to Fenwick," she said, "not to live. I would like to keep the practice. There are people there who need it, and I would go back several times a year, but I am not going back." She said it the way she said everything, clearly, without ornament, having already decided the thing behind the eyes before she spoke. "If that is acceptable." "It is more than acceptable," I said. "It is what I was hoping for and did not know how to ask." She turned her head and looked at me with the gray-green eyes and the beginning of a smile that had been undoing me at intervals for 5 years and which, now that it was close enough to not have to remember, was considerably more powerful than I had been prepared for. "You are a king," she said. You could have simply asked. I was concerned about the answer. Kale, she said, and it was my name, the given one, the one from the river crossing. I have been waiting for 4 years to find the right shape for the truth. The shape is this. I stayed in Fenwick because it was the honest thing. I am staying here because it is also the honest thing. Those are not contradictions. No, I said, they are not. Below us, Wren looked up again, and this time she came to the wall and held up her arms, and I reached down and lifted her onto the wall between us, and she settled there with a pebble in each hand and her legs swinging over the river, entirely unafraid of the height, looking at the copper water below with the same expression she brought to everything. Open, interested, ready. The three of us sat on the Ashwater wall as the light went down. I thought about a river crossing, and a flat stone, and a child with silver-gray eyes who had been waiting without fear, because she had been promised things would come good. The hold behind us had the smell of wood smoke and river stone, and the particular warmth of a place where all its wolves were settled. And for the first time in longer than I could account for, I did not feel like a king managing an empty room. I felt like a man sitting on a wall with his daughter between his hands and the woman he should have written to 5 years ago at his shoulder, watching the river turn from copper to gray to the deep quiet silver of a Kelvorn evening. Wren leaned back against my chest and held up the smooth white pebble from the Ashwater ford. This one is the best, she said. I am keeping this one always. I closed my hand gently over hers, over the pebble and the small certain fist. Yes, I said, so am I.